Throughout history, freethinkers have outraged the religious with their wacky ideas about the virtues of free speech, reason, and of course, eating babies. Now, God is dying, and it's time to dispose of his remains. From the pits of hell, Satan sends two puppets of the imperialist West and the Zionist Jews against God, Islam, and tiny kittens to bring you their propaganda and conspire for a new world order. This is Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment with Ali Rizwi and Maryam Namazie.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. It's a very, very special episode. Today we are joined by the irrepressible human rights activist and founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, Maryam Namazie, who I should say, and I'm going to embarrass you again, Maryam, a personal hero of mine for many, many years now. I know she's also a personal hero of Armin's. I mean, he said that many times too. Yeah. And she's been here before, and today we actually are going to speak about there is an explosive new documentary that Maryam has executive produced along with Geeta Sehgal and some other people. It's called Women Leaving Islam, right? And this is a topic we've talked about here a lot. We've had many guests, many women ex-Muslims, who from a variety of backgrounds. And the film itself features women with some incredible stories who come from a variety of backgrounds. So some of the backgrounds there come from Bangladeshi, British background, Egyptian, Moroccan, Saudi, Somali, Kenyan, Pakistani, and Tanzanian. And these are women who dared to leave the religion they were brought up in, which is Islam. And the stories, the way the documentary is done, Maryam, is just, it's amazing, it's moving, it's riveting. You watch it, it's heartbreaking and it's inspiring at the same time. And I wanted to start, right, just by asking you, and I know one thing is, people in the ex-Muslim community, there is a very different experience that women go through. Like the kind of threats and everything that they get are very different from the kind that many of the men get. So what brought this about? The project of the documentary, and why did you decide to do it now?
Yeah, thank you, Ali and Armin. I know he's having some technical issues, but it's great to have to be here, and I'm thankful that you've invited me here. Yeah, I agree. It's such a beautiful documentary, and I kind of loved it so much, and I felt moved every time I watched it, even though I watched it 100 times before it was actually broadcast. And the idea behind it was that initially, when the ex-Muslim movement began, there were a lot of men and very few women who were visible, and it was obvious that women also were free thinkers. They also wanted to leave Islam, but they were faced with a lot more difficulties in doing so because there was a lot more control over them in their homes, for example. It was more difficult for them to be invisible to some extent because of the hijab and the sort of social controls. It wasn't easy for them to come in and out of ex-Muslim gatherings. And so we kind of wanted to highlight what it feels specifically for women to be able to leave Islam, why it's got added difficulties for them to do that. And what was interesting, though, is that this film took more than 3 years to make because all the original women pulled out for various reasons, many of them because they decided that it was too risky, even though many of them, a majority of them, were not going to be showing their faces and were going to have their voices changed. Because they were ordinary women who the stories were so inspiring, beautiful, heartbreaking, heart-wrenching at the same time. Really, it's such a loss that none of those stories were able to come to light. And I'm hoping that eventually, in 20 years, 30 years time, we might be able to bring those voices to light. So we had to basically go back to the drawing board. Imagine, after having done all this filming and editing, and then just go back, and we decided, well, let's interview only activist women, because they've already come out publicly. We know that they've agreed to take that risk already with their lives, and so we're not going to have the same problems. And that's why now this film focuses on ex-Muslim women activists, 6 of them from very different backgrounds. And I think not even so, even though they are activists, many of them are known already, their stories are really important to be heard. And we did have this issue too with the film being very long. It's about an hour and a half long, and we know that's not the right way to do things. It should be a lot shorter. And we just felt like, you know what, we know it's not going to be broadcast in cinemas or in art festivals because our issue is still so taboo. So let's give the time and space for women to be able to speak and for people to hear them. And I think, you know, it did work in the sense that people really got a sense of who they were, their struggles, and how much what a price they've paid for their freedom.
Mm-hmm. I think specifically, for me, the time just flew by. It just seemed like a feature-length movie documentary. Mm-hmm. So it seemed really appropriate. But if you're saying that you had, there's so many aspects to their lives, right? It wasn't just the fact that they leave Islam. It's, you know, all of us are so much more than what we believe. Many of these women they've lost their families. Some of them have built new families. One was separated from her child. Another one just had another child. So you get to see a really multi-dimensional view of their lives, in the sense that, you know, they're human beings living lives like everybody else. And it's not just that they left Islam because, you know, they wanted to change their mind and become activists. It's something that actually impacted their lives, and they were almost compelled to break out of it. I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the documentary. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, you know, really bringing about the entire the human element of their lives, and not just the ideological aspect. I think that was the part of it that was really, really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, like you say, people are human beings. We have many characteristics that define us, not just our atheism, for example, you know, but we are so many more things, both belief-wise as well as who we are as people. And I think one of the things that comes out in this film is that, you know, the fact that you become a non-believer is very much linked to other aspects of your life as well, particularly when it comes to women, because the restrictions of religion on women in particular, the targeting of women in particular, makes it all the more difficult to say that you're a free thinker, because it is locked up with so many other issues that are matters of survival and life for you as a woman. So as you mentioned, Fawzia from Pakistan, Fawzia Ilyas, you know, when she when it became clear that she's a non-believer, her husband, who was a violent man, you know, took her to, when she wanted to ask for a divorce, he accused her of blasphemy, which meant that she lost custody of her daughter. And you can imagine how painful that must be, you know, to lose custody of your child, and to know that you may never see your child again. You know, one of the things she ends in the film, one of her statements is that she hopes that one day when her daughter is old enough to have access possibly to social media, she'll look for her maybe, and that she has hope that as an adult she might be able to see her daughter, you know. And you've got someone like Faye Rahman, who was in a very violent situation family-wise. I mean, it's so distressing to hear what she went through as a child herself, but also looking after other siblings. And this, you know, her act of leaving her home but leaving her siblings behind, in a violent situation, and that guilt and that, heartbreak that never ever leaves you. You've got people like Mimsy Vids, who, she talks about how she went and spoke to her family, telling them, I'm the same person, I'll always love you, and them saying, well, no, it's everything has changed now. And the heartbreak of that, and you've got woman after woman giving stories like that.
Mm-hmm. Armin, you had a question.
Sorry if my audio is bad. My connection is very bad today. Why do you think the backlash that women get when they abandon religion from friends and family is a lot stronger than men get? Not to dismiss the backlash that men get, they also go through a lot. But why is it comparatively a lot stronger, a lot more aggressive with women?
Yeah, I think, when you look at women's role in religion and even in national culture, in patriarchal culture, in religious culture, very much women are seen to be those that, their role is limited to those who are reproducing the next generation of the patriot and citizen, or the next generation of the religious community. And so there's a lot of pressure on making sure women do as they're meant to do, as a way of managing control of the community. And so, it is very much a control of women's sexuality, a woman's body, as a way of keeping control over the rules and regulations of a community. So I think that's very much why women face the sort of threats and abuse in a very different way. It's seen to be such a violation of the rules and regulations to have women transgress, to have women criticize and question religion. And if you look back at Islam as well, you see how women are seen to be, for example, the source of chaos and fitna in society. If they're not following the rules, if they're not properly veiled, everything goes to hell if women don't abide by the rules. And that's the sort of constant propaganda we hear. And you have in Iran, for example, where veiling is compulsory, even according to the law. Anytime there is any issue, from an earthquake to rivers running dry, anything going wrong, and it goes back to the fact that women are not properly veiled in Iran, for example. And so you've got this sort of, women are the line of, for them, the line that needs to be held. And that's why when the religious right come to power, they always target women first. They come for women first. And in a way, I think women are seen to be property of communities and families and societies. Even today, they are seen to be properties and belonging to the community. And so I think they are seen to be more expendable, and it is easier to give control of women over to the community. You see that in even places like Britain, where you have Sharia courts. The government will say they're dealing with trivial matters, mundane matters, but the matters they deal with are matters related to women and the family, their role in the family. And so you can see how easily women can be used as pawns, and they are also seen as the first line of defense for religious national movements as well.
I think, there's some terms here, like honor culture, modesty culture, and if there was ever an extension of rape culture, it would be modesty culture in a way. What you're talking about, the rules and regulations, there's an aspect of honor that the women are tasked to protect. If there is, we hear about the honor killings all the time. If a woman brings dishonor to the family, if she goes out, and takes off her hijab when she goes into public, or, people have, where I'm sitting in Mississauga, Ontario, there was a girl many years ago who was killed by her father and her brother because she left the house with a hijab, and then she took it off when she got to school. We see this around the world. If they fall in love with somebody and want to choose their own romantic partner, or even get married to them. They marry by choice. They've brought dishonor to the family. So there's that aspect, and that you see in when Armin talks about the aggressive, people are much more aggressive towards women who leave Islam. You can see that in the kind of threats that they get. I have people who disagree with me, and they'll say that you'll get death threats, you'll get threats of violence, but one of the threats, the common kind of threat that I get, and that Armin also has gotten, is just sexualized threats for our spouses, for our sisters, our mothers. Like, this is what we're going to do to your family member, our daughters, right? There's it's all of their sort of Islamic virtue, and you have to be good, and all of that goes completely out the window, and they think they're doing the right thing. And I think that this is one of the biggest things I've seen with women who leave Islam, is that I would think it takes a lot more courage, because that you're just going to get attacked in one of the most brutal, sexualized way. That's an aspect of it. I think that's much. It may even be a much bigger barrier for women to leave, because then if they leave, then their moral character is questioned. Well, now that you've left Islam, you can drink, you can have sex with everybody else. You're, they get slut shamed. That's something that a lot of men don't necessarily have to go through.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, though, that people don't necessarily leave Islam thinking about the threats. Do you know what I mean? People leave or live as they need to live, because that's just part of, being fully human, isn't it? To be able to think as you want and to live as you want. And so obviously the reality of what happens after you do that is very difficult. And I know many women who have gone back to being Muslim as a result of the pressures. I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah.
There is so much pressure, and also the sort of shunning and ostracization, and the fact that you have no one anymore. You really have nobody else that you can call a friend, that you can call a family member. And unless you really are strong in creating a new community from scratch, very often, because you would have been very much, very often you'll be within a sort of community where it's everything to you, your family and your friends and your schoolmates, it's all linked to that religious community, and it is starting from scratch. There's a lot of pressure, and a lot of people can't take it. And I know a lot of people who've faced huge amounts of abuse who've gone back to that abusive situation because they just can't manage it. And that's that's just the reality of things. It's very difficult, and you can understand why people find it so difficult to do that. But we have to, that's why in a way we have to make sure that people have enough support so that when they do make that move, that they don't feel alone, but the reality is that many people do continue to feel that way. And when it comes to women, you're completely right. It is that modesty culture, and it is this idea that women are an extension of the family, of the community, of the society, and therefore what they do is very, very important. And that's why so much of the resources and energy goes into sort of making sure women know their place in society, make sure that they don't go beyond what is the requirements of how women should behave, how women should dress, how they should speak, their voice, from controlling their voice to controlling their movements.
Yeah. What in the film you have? Yeah. Sorry, Armin. Do you have a question? Let's do that.
Yeah, I was wondering, because the flip side of my first question regarding why they get the disproportionate negative reaction from the Muslim community when they leave, it seems I don't know if we're imagining this, because I have noticed this, and a lot of other people also mention it. I don't know if this is not enough sample size, but there's a lot of commentary on this, on why it seems like in the ex-Muslim community, a lot of ex-Muslim women end up in positions of leadership, like they seem to be leading the way in many in the movement, like yourself, for example, Sarah Haider, Zara Kay. They seem to be at the front lines at these when it comes to activism. Is this something we're imagining, or if it's true that it seems to be disproportionately representing the leading the movement? And if it is true, why do you think, what's behind this? Like, why is it happening?
I mean, I think it's true in the ex-Muslim movement for sure, and I also think it's true when you look at progressive social and political movements in countries where there is Islamic rules and regulations. So you see that in Pakistan, for example, in the Aurat March, and the sort of visibility of women who are breaking taboos in such an amazing way, despite the sort of constant threats, and even the fact that they live in a country where blasphemy is punishable by death. And you see that in a place like Iran, for example, where a lot of the social political movements are led by women. I think partly it has to do with the fact that, because women are the first targets, that their sort of reaction is, in a sense, you feel like you have nothing left to lose because you are under constant attack and constantly being targeted. And so there is this feeling that there is nothing left to lose, that if you want to defend your rights and your lives, you have to confront this sort of religious right movement, the Islamist religion's role in the state. And also because it impacts every aspect of your life. Look, if Fawzia wants to leave Islam, she loses her child. If Rana Ahmad wants to no longer be Muslim, she wants to be an atheist, she has to flee the country and leave everything behind. I know men have to do that too, but what I mean is that you have to break everything. You have to lie, that your father signed a paper for you so that you can get out of Saudi Arabia and get to Germany. If you're someone like Zara Kay, who's also in the film, you do have to, even break relations with your family and leave everything behind. And we see even when, she tries to go back to Tanzania, make amends with her family, work things out with her family, you've got the religious community trying to get her arrested and persecute her for being an atheist. So there's a lot riding on the fact that you want to be free, and it affects your marriage, it affects your child custody, it affects what you want to wear, because the very removing of a hijab is such a visible way of challenging the religious right. For a man, you can still dress the way you want and people won't necessarily notice that you're challenging religious rules. But for women, like in Iran, you see the unveiling movement is such a key movement for women's rights, because the very act of unveiling is a direct challenge to the rule of the religious right. And so you do see women coming head to head more visibly, and I think that's why a lot of that is translated then into sort of the leadership positions you see women taking.
Mm-hmm. I think, when you said they want to be free, that's really what it's about. It's not just about leaving a religion or thinking differently. I mean, all of that is part of it, but a lot of this is motivated by just wanting to be free from the rules and the shackles and everything that's been imposed on you. And that applies to a variety of women in different ways. In the film, we see some of the women from very conservative backgrounds, like Rana Ahmed, like Faye Rahman, who came from a Salafi background, where her father was very, very sort of ultra conservative, Wahhabist, Salafist Muslim. And then you also have the examples of someone like Zara Kay, whose family is comparatively sort of more moderate. And you mentioned that, for those who don't know, Zara did go back to Tanzania recently to spend time with her family, who she is on good terms with. And when she was there, the community essentially tried to get her arrested. She was arrested, and she was trapped there for quite a while. I think a couple of months almost, and until she made it back to Australia, thankfully, but largely in part due to the efforts of your organization, Maryam. So, what are some of the differences that you have seen, and some of the similarities between women who come from extremely restrictive religious backgrounds versus women who come from sort of more moderate and liberal family backgrounds, like and I'm assuming such as yourself?
I mean, I suppose for me, one of the most important things is having family support. I think that's such an important thing for me. I mean, my parents are Muslim, but they have always supported me, and unconditionally. And I think that makes a big difference in being able to live my life without the constant feeling of guilt. Because I think guilt has a lot. If you look at people's family relationships, no matter how abusive family members have been, you see how guilty people feel for not doing what their family wants of them and requires of them, and how they feel that they've let their family down. And it's quite heartbreaking to see, because you see, Faye mentions it in the film, where she says, when she reported her father to social services, she says that she feels like she's knifed her best friend in the back, sort of thing, and this constant guilt that follows people. And if you come from a family where they're not against your apostasy, they don't necessarily agree with you, but they don't threaten you, they don't try to limit you, you still have their love. I think it does make a big difference. But the end result, I think, is the same, because while it's much more difficult for women who come from families that are abusive, that are controlling, that are extremist, that the end result is that they have reached and are living the lives of their choosing. And that is something great to see. I think whatever people's choices are, to be able to live in a way that's not harming anybody else, but that they're living their true selves without having to live the way their families or the larger community wants. And I think that's very important, to have that. And I think one of the questions we asked all the women is, do you regret all of this that's happened to you? For example, Halima is another woman, Halima Salat, who tried to stop the mutilation of a young girl. She herself had been through FGM in Kenya. She's from a Somali background. The family had tried to exorcise her, tied her up, beat her up. So she has lost a lot by challenging the norms, as have all the women in the film. But when you ask them if they regret it, none of them regret it. It's painful, of course. It's painful. It's something that they'll always, the trauma of it, they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives. But nobody regrets it. And I think if you're able to live the life that you want and of your choosing, it does make things a little easier, doesn't it? Because at least you're being true to yourself. You're living the life that you want.
Mm-hmm. Armin.
Ali, I think we should spend a little bit extra time on the Patreon questions, because I know some of them are from atheist women in very religious countries. And they're very excited to be able to ask Maryam some questions. So I do think, like, if we have extra time to highlight them and answer them, that would be great.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say the same thing. There's some excellent questions coming from the patrons today. So I thought we'll just go ahead and start with some of them. So Goddess Katie is asking, how much has Maryam faced off with the kind of feminists who insist on promoting hijab as empowerment and Islam as a feminist religion?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's something we all face. If anyone who criticizes the veil, or who is critical of religion's perspective on women, what their place should be in society, will face those so-called feminists who think that to defend minority women, they have to defend the veil. And I think, I do think that it comes from a good place, in the sense that people don't want minorities to be under attack. They don't want Muslim women to face discrimination and abuse in the streets, and neither do any of us. I think rightly they're concerned about the rise of the far right, for example, in Europe and the West. But I think that's why it makes our work very difficult, in the sense that we have to explain that whilst we want no one to face discrimination for how they choose to wear, what they choose to wear, that we also have to have this conversation that when it comes to the veil, there is very little choice involved, because it is a religious prescription. It is something that has been imposed by religion on women. And the reason behind it is that women are seen to be the source of fitna and chaos in society if they're not covered up, if their voices are heard, if their hair is shown. And so I think we have a lot of work to do in explaining that, while at the same time making sure that women who are veiled don't feel unsafe on the streets. And one of the examples I always give, be against FGM, but you're not advocating for women and girls who've been mutilated to be attacked on the streets. They're two very different things. Your defense of women means that you have to also oppose the veil, because it is fundamentally misogynist, anti-woman. It is an extension of modesty culture. And I think we have to have these conversations. We have to have these conversations. They're difficult. There's a lot of emotion around these issues. And I don't know, we've come to a point in the societies where we live, where we cannot have discussions without it then becoming, escalating. And I think it's sort of the sort of mob rule and mob threats of the religious right has escalated everything, so that you cannot have these discussions without you either being a fascist or you being an Islamist, and it's this constant extremes. And we need to have these conversations coolly, calmly, but we have to have them, because for me, I think criticizing the veil is intrinsic to defending women's rights. You cannot defend women's rights if you're going to defend religious prescriptions to control and manage women's sexuality. Of course, you can defend religion or you can defend women's rights. I don't think you can do both, because they contradict each other.
Yeah, that's definitely a quote for the ages. Nicholas is asking, do you think the visibility of ex-Muslim women has changed in the last few years for better or worse? Earlier, you mentioned that it was still a taboo topic, so I think it should be quick, because we already talked about this a little bit in terms of ex-Muslim women being pretty prominent in the movement.
Yeah, I mean, definitely women are more prominent. And I think, this prominence is important, because it just doesn't only break the taboo of the right to blasphemy and apostasy, but also the right to be free from religious constraints on women's body and her sexuality and her rights. And so I think that's why that's why the religious right are so hateful when it comes to women breaking these taboos, because it challenges so much more than the right to free thought and apostasy and blasphemy. But it goes to the core of religion's view on women and her body.
Maryam,
Oh, sorry. He got cut out just as he was going to ask a question, but he will be back. In the meantime, we'll take it. Oh, wait, is he back? He's back. Armin. Okay, we'll just, until he comes on, we'll just take this question from Goddess Katie. Are women more likely to leave Islam because they are oppressed, or are they less likely due to lack of external influence and education? Armin, we'll do your question right after.
I mean, I think that there is no correlation between education and oppression. And I mean, I think that you can find women who are free thinkers in the smallest of villages and fundamentalists in universities, you know. So I think that it is very much linked, I do think, with political and social movements that give women the option to see that other ways of living is possible. And so I do think, for example, that had it not been for the ex-Muslim movement starting 13, 14 years ago as a political movement, not people just coming out and saying that they were apostles, but organizing as a political and social movement, that we would not have as many ex-Muslims today. I can say that with complete confidence, that that is a fact. If you don't have an unveiling movement in Iran, you will have less women who feel that they have the right to be unveiled and to dream of a life without the veil. So I think, you know, political and social movements are very key, and it affects women who might have very high levels of education and no education at all. And so I think that that's why, for me, political and social movements are so key in bringing about change, because it not only fights for that change, but it creates a space where some other type of life becomes possible.
Mm-hmm. Armin, you want to ask a question?
No, just quickly, before I run out, I just want to say that it's also telling that a lot of conservatives who are atheists and non-religious are promoting religion because they think they want to control women and put women in their position that they like. They think they like Christianity or Islam, not because they believe it's true, but because they think they're right about women, and they want to use those tools as a way to maintain their power over them, which is, I mean, it shows how powerful these Christianity and Islam are at doing that, given that people who don't even believe in them sometimes try to promote them for that reason. Anyways, thanks.
That's so true. It's so true. Do you have anything? Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to give you an example of this woman, Afsaneh Lasho. She's one of the women's rights campaigners I work with here against Sharia courts. Now, she is from a Muslim background. Her husband was a French Catholic, and they lived in Dubai. And the French Catholic husband used Sharia law to prevent her from having child custody. And so she's actually not seen her son Louis for many years. Because, you know, it is how useful religion is in making sure that women who question violence and question the role that's been assigned to them, how they all seem to work together in order to make sure that those rules and regulations stay in place, you know, and it benefits them all. So another example with Sharia courts here in Britain, you had the Archbishop of Canterbury defending Sharia courts, because, you know, one religious court is always beneficial to some other religious, a completely different religion as well, because it helps maintain the status quo, it helps maintain religion's role in the state. And it's a very useful thing, particularly to manage dissent, as we see with apostasy and blasphemy laws, and particularly to manage, you know, these wayward, troublesome women who are defiling, you know, and causing trouble and whoring about. I mean, the sort of the witches and the whores and the sort of image that religion has of every woman that doesn't abide by its rules. So it is a very useful thing to have. And that's why I think, as Armin says, you know, you do find it being defended by people who you would be surprised at defending religious rules.
Yeah, especially more recently, I think. Dolly is asking, what do you think about ex-Muslim women who face sexual abuse from their friends, family, and authorities? How they can overcome that, and how to become proactive and ignore shaming and blaming?
Well, that's a very difficult question, isn't it? I mean, it is, I guess it's a question for any woman who's faced sexual abuse from whatever background. There is so much self-hate, self-blame, not just by the woman herself, but I mean, this is something we see even in from non-Muslim backgrounds. What was she wearing? Did she have too much to drink? Did she lead the person on? You know, it's a constant attempt at blaming and shaming women. And I think, you know, we have to do the hard work of changing that culture and that way of looking at sexual abuse and violence, defending women, questioning the sort of extension really of modesty culture again, isn't it? Where women are shamed and blamed for any violence that they face. And of course, we know that this is a battle that's taking place across the globe, including in countries that are not under Islamic rule. And it's a huge battle. But I think linking up with the women's rights movement, linking up with the movement against, with the movement of those who are fighting against sexual violence, against violence against women, and actually shame culture rather than women who've faced abuse and violence.
Yeah, and it's important to note, and I think I've heard you say this many times, that, you know, modesty culture implies that the only modest woman is a covered woman. So a woman who is not covered is somehow immodest, or, you know, and then that obviously gives a lot of people license to do with them as they please in a lot of people's mentalities. Just a comment here. You mentioned the Aurat March in Pakistan. It's a women's march in Pakistan. This is from Secular Proton, and they're saying that the Aurat March movement has created a lot of dialogue in Pakistan. For my social group, almost everybody was talking about it. It's sad to see many against it, but at least they're talking about it. I think that this is a good point. It really works. Like the way that activism works a lot of times is not that you are immediately getting people on your side and convincing them in the short term. That has never happened in history. Right? Anybody who brought transformative change, initially they had massive opposition, but ultimately when the conversation began, that's what the beginnings of the change are. So I think that in itself is probably a much bigger goal, just to get people.
And also I do think that the women in the Aurat March and men actually represent a lot larger of a population than we can imagine, but they are very often a silent, I think, a large number, a very silent group of people, because of the sorts of threats and intimidations that surround these sorts of issues. And I think, you know, very often activists that break taboos are the tip of a very large iceberg, but you can only see that tip. And eventually, the more they normalize, you know, the issue that they're fighting for, whether it's of the right to blasphemy or for women's rights and bodily integrity, the more you get to see how big that groundswell of support is. And in reality, you know, it is difficult work. Taboo breaking work is difficult. And particularly because those who are against it are so vocal, they're so intimidating, they're so threatening, you know, and so it seems as if they have more support because they're so loud and they're so, you know, so violent in a sense, because it's not just the threats, it is what's behind the threats, what we know can come from their opposition, that makes these issues so difficult. And so I think, you know, we have a responsibility to stand with the women, for example, and men who are part of the Aurat March, the women who are leading the unveiling movement in Iran, the ex-Muslims who are fighting for the right to apostasy. Even if we are believers, whatever our position on things, we need to be able to really surround these movements and support them, show solidarity with them, strengthen them, so that they know that they're not alone and that they're able to then move forward. Because if the Awrad March wins, if the women's unveiling movement in Iran wins, if the ex-Muslim movement wins, it's really a win for everyone, because it is a fight for fundamental human rights, and it actually benefits those who are religious as well, because people who are religious are not necessarily, and more likely than not, they're not fundamentalists. And the more we're able to push back the fundamentalists, the better it is, I think, for everyone, for at least the majority of people in the world.
Yeah, specifically for Pakistan, though, I will say, I mean, you're right about the silent majority, because whenever they have elections, like publicly, everybody has to show that they're, the more Islamic you are, the better. But when it comes to elections and they're actually in the voting booth, the Islamist parties just don't do as well. They barely, get a tiny fraction of the vote. It's really interesting the way that dynamic plays out too. Now, this is a question that I wanted to add something to as well. So from Goddess Katie again, she's saying, as an ex-Muslim woman, what do you think about the ex-Muslim movement right now? Do you think it is a great movement for women, or is there something lacking which needs attention? And here, I also wanted to kind of tag along the other point recently. Ayan Hirsi Ali, who's also a very prominent ex-Muslim woman, and she's more on the conservative side. Her new book, you had a pretty scathing critique of it, and she noticed that, and there was a little bit of back and forth. So maybe if you could touch on that as well, some of the state of the ex-Muslim movement right now, the women in the ex-movement, the Muslim movement, and some of the differences that you may have.
I mean, I think that obviously the ex-Muslim movement is important for women because it is opening up the space for blasphemy and for apostasy. And a woman who transgresses religious rules and norms is an apostate and is a blasphemer by the very nature of challenging religious rules and norms. And so it has great relevance to women in the sense that it opens up a space for women to live and think differently. But like any movement, the ex-Muslim movement is not a response to every single issue in the world, in the same way that, the civil rights movement in the United States didn't necessarily address gay rights. The gay rights movement in the West doesn't necessarily address Black Lives Matters. Movements are relevant because they focus on specific issues, and those issues are so key to so many people across various classes and belief systems that it becomes relevant. Because do you know what I mean? So you can be conservative and communist and a liberal and still defend and think that the ex-Muslim movement is important when it comes to the right to apostasy and blasphemy. Right. But that doesn't mean that ex-Muslims are a monolith, in the same way that we keep explaining Muslims are not a monolith, in the same way that all British people are not Tory supporters or Brexit supporters. Do you know what I mean? That we have differences of opinion. And so I think it's not an end-all for women. I think the struggle for women's rights is much more expansive than the ex-Muslim movement. And a lot more needs to be done to defend women's rights. But as a movement that is fighting for apostasy and blasphemy laws, it has great relevance and is very important for women's rights.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask this, again,
I didn't mention, sorry, Ayan Hirsi Ali. Sorry, I didn't mention.
Yeah.
And if I can just add a point on that issue, is that, again, just because I'm an ex-Muslim, Armin's an ex-Muslim, Ali's an ex-Muslim, Ayan Hirsi Ali's an ex-Muslim, doesn't mean that we agree on everything and anything, just like Muslims don't agree on everything and anything. And so I think it's a good thing, in fact, to understand that we are individuals. We are not groups of people. We are individuals with our own positions on things. And I think a lot of it comes down to our political and social views on issues. And so I don't agree with a lot of what Ayan Hirsi Ali says. Again, I find it a bit, I don't know, annoying, for lack of a better word, that people would say that I'm now standing with the Islamists because I don't agree with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or that people are disappointed in me for criticizing her. Well, of course, I'll criticize whoever I think has regressive politics. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali's politics are extremely regressive. I think that she tries to racialize crime, and she tries to criminalize migration. She equates migrants with Islamists. And it is kind of, to me, like equating white people with white supremacy. Just because someone is white doesn't mean that they're white supremacists. Just because someone is a migrant doesn't mean, from Muslim background, doesn't mean that they're Islamist. And so I have great problems with reducing a challenge to a religious right movement with, combating migration and trying to stop some of the most vulnerable people in our world from reaching safety, and
including us,
persecution, including Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who
yeah.
herself was an asylum seeker. So, I mean, again, it's not a question of being disappointed. This is about politics, I think, fundamentally, and the fact that we should be able to criticize each other, to be able to question and challenge each other, and and that's part of being human, and it's an important thing to be able to do, and something that we have to constantly fight for.
Yeah, I should also say that I think the fact that there are differences of opinion is a good thing. It shows the growth and health of a movement. I mean, I remember I was talking to you before the show that, when I first met you, it was in 2007 or something, and that there were only a handful of people speaking, and you were one of them. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was one of them too, and both of you. None of this means that nobody respects her story and what she has had to overcome, but there are differences of opinion, and that just shows that there is a movement that is becoming bigger, and there is diversity of opinion and thought within those movements as well. I have there's a couple of really good questions I wanted to get to. We've got about 9 minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Dolly is saying, in your opinion, how can ex-Muslim women in Egypt make a change and claim their right? Or does that look like an impossible dream? So do you have any familiarity with
Well, I mean, I think we have Nawal al-Sadawi, who is an ex-Muslim woman in Egypt, who has, made all of us dream, even though we are not Egyptian. And, she is someone who has been a great hero for many across the globe. And I think it is about struggle. I mean, the reality is, look, I'm someone who's very much on the left, and I do think that for real fundamental changes, we need another type of system. I think a system which is based on profit is a system that will not ever respect people's rights and welfare. And that's why I think that when we fight for any gain for human rights, it can easily be taken away, very easily. A lot of the fights that we thought, we take for granted, the right to abortion in Poland, in the United States,
Right.
a lot of these rights can easily be taken away. And I think it is because, a system that puts profit before human welfare will always benefit those who are maintaining the status quo, and that includes religious rules. So for me, I think fundamentally we need a change in the system, but that doesn't mean that we can't fight for reforms, that we can't fight as much as possible for basic human rights and freedoms. And I do think that it all boils down to how hard you fight, and how much of a movement you can create, and how much you keep fighting, because the minute you sit back, it can be taken away from you again. I mean, that's just my perspective on things. And so I think, you keep fighting. There's so many great women in Egypt, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in South Asia, across the globe, that are fighting for things. We need to link up with each other. And that's one of the wonderful things about social media and the internet. We are now able to link up. We are no longer invisible. We are visible. We have a presence thanks to social media. And no matter how much they censor us and how much they try to stop our voices from being heard, we are linked together in a way that would seem impossible many years ago. And so we have to build on that. But of course, the fascists and the Islamists, they're using the internet as much as well. They are organizing as well. They are not only in power, but they also have huge presence and are able to, organize and mobilize on social media as well. It's a fight. There is no guaranteed who wins, and that's the difficulty and the beauty of it, isn't it? That it is up to us.
I have to say, like, on an optimistic note, a lot of the fascists and the Islamists that you're talking about, a lot of the Dawa people, now their entire movement seems to be consistent, almost entirely of just responding to the secular ex-Muslim movement. So I think that is actually an optimistic note as well, as annoying as it can be sometimes. I wanted to say before we went to, I think we're going to take one more question because of time. But with this movie, I almost see that if this was a series in some ways, where whether you have individual stories or you have one aspect of their lives, like ex-Muslims who are mothers, like I know Halima and Fazia, Mimzi, all of them, they have children, they have families. There could be, this is just a suggestion, but I think it would be so inspiring to see how some of them did build their lives. How Dolly's question is talking about how do you claim your right, and not, like women who ended up in great careers, or women who ended up, building a sense of family and friends and, a community around them after going through the struggle as well. If there was something like that, you did focus on some of that in this documentary, but I think if that came about, those were some of the most important things. It's very inspiring to people who feel stuck. Like, what happens on the other side? I'm going to leave my family, I'm going to leave my country, I'm going to leave everything I grew up with, and I'm going to go to this new place. What's on the other side? It's so uncertain. And if they see what is on the other side and how these people made it, I think that would be just maybe a sequel or next part of the series.
Yeah, I think there's so many stories really that we have, to say, and that we're not allowed to. I mean, I think that's one of the problems. I did a TEDx talk, TEDx Warwick talk last year in January, and it was about how we use creativity in order to challenge Islam and the fundamentalists. And that it is also so much about us having the right to tell our stories as well, to have some sort of visibility, and to be able to say who we are without constantly being told that who we are is, something that's so offensive that we're not allowed to speak and we're not allowed to live the way that we want. And of course, that TEDx talk has not been broadcast.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, it violates community standards. Our whole lives seem to violate community standards.
Is there any access to it, Maryam? Is there any way that you can do the talk in another way and put it out?
I keep telling myself I should be taping my stuff because there's so much that isn't ever broadcast that I should be filming secretly myself, but I don't have it. But we are thinking of doing a documentary just of that TEDx talk and trying to get that out in the open. But what I mean is that there is such a need for stories. And I think stories are important because it goes to the heart of resistance. It makes people human. And that's one of the reasons, behind the film too, is to humanize people who are so often dehumanized just because they don't want to live according to religion's rules, And I think that is important. We have to get our stories out there. We have to humanize ourselves. Unfortunately, no one else will do that for us. And we have to make sure that people know that there are so many of us. And they are learning that. But there's still a long way to go, particularly given the fact that there's so many people in countries under Islamic rule that are living in very, very dangerous, risky situations.
Mm-hmm. This is gonna be the last question. I know that there's a few more, so sorry, patrons. I know that this is it's obviously there's so many things to talk about. His secular Proton's asking again. He's saying, I can imagine for men, or they are saying, I don't know what this is. I can imagine for men, it's also easier to hide their lack of belief. For women, it will be much harder since they're restricted in almost every way. They can't get out of home without permission. Right, so they can't even hide it.
Yeah, definitely. Right. I mean, one is there's more control over girls and women, but also, you know, it's the very veil itself makes it very clear. You know, you unveil if you take the veil off when you're outside of your home, put it back on when you go back home. There are people who might see you along the way. There's so much more risk involved when you are a woman. But that's, of course, not to say that men don't face similar risks. But as you said, Ali, no one will ever say that they're going to rape my husband. But, you know, the opposite is always true when it comes to women. Of course, now I'm over 50. You know, that sort of sexual violence is a lot less. Now I'm called old hag and grandma, which is fine by me, you know, but what I mean is, like, there is always that underlying threat, but it happens a lot more to younger women in particular, and women who are seen to be, you know, of reproductive age. I think that's really very interesting, but they never stop. Even when you look at ISIS and the fact that any woman over 40 was killed because they couldn't sell them on a slave market anymore. This idea that, you know, women are only for that period when they're of reproductive age, which is interesting because women still have to wear the veil when they're in their 90s as well. You know, so that control continues, but this focus on young women in particular, I think it's a very, very difficult. The constant harassment and abuse and constant, you know, interference in your life. I mean, because I lived in Sudan, you know, this idea that my landlady could actually come into my house without knocking because I was a young woman, and they could just do and say what they wanted with me. People stopping me on the street, telling me what I'm wearing. In Iran, it's the same. If you're a woman and you are seen to be Muslim and you go into a shop during Ramadan, they want to know why you're not veiled. This idea that everybody is in charge of you, you know, it's not just your family, but everybody has to make sure that you toe the line. Otherwise, the whole society will go to hell, according to them. It is what makes it very difficult to be women.
Right. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up now, guys. I actually had a hard stop at this time. We'll end with this comment from Goddess Katie. She's saying, I can understand Armin's frustration to have the Maryam Namazie on the show and a bad connection at the same time. So I know that Armin has been very frustrated this morning with this. And but Maryam, like, we're definitely going to badger you to come on again. Over and over again at different times. So I'm sure that Armin will get his chance. For everybody who's listening, thank you, Maryam, for joining us. This was really insightful. The documentary is brilliant. Please go and watch it. All of the links are in the description. And for those of you who are listening to this on audio, please do consider becoming a patron. You can go to patreon.com/SJME, and if for as little as $1, you can get 5 live streams a month. You can join in live, watch it, and then also comment and participate.
And go support the Council of Ex-Muslims of Great Britain and follow Maryam Namazie wherever on Twitter and all her accounts.
Yeah, yeah, and well, Maryam, you started it all, and we're all here in large part, you know, because of you.
You made our job easier. You started all this, and you made it easier for the rest of us to follow.
I would say you made our job.
Well,
I think.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, that is the great thing about movements, isn't it? It's all of us working together to make change, and we can see it in our lifetime because things change so quickly nowadays, don't they? So,
we
owe you some.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Maria.
I'm going to go. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
The Secular Jihadists have been made possible thanks to the Illuminati and the covert support of Israel and the CIA. That's what we have been told, but we haven't received our checks yet. If you like what we do, please support us. Share the podcast with your friends. Write and tweet us with topic and guest suggestions. Or head over to secularjihadist.com and give $1 or more for exclusive access to live video. Have your questions read and answered on the air, and more. Till next time, may the flying spaghetti monster be with you.